IBESS, Water and Aquatic Food Production, Part 9, will examine the idea that harvesting some species can be controversial. In the harvesting of certain species, ethical issues arise over the rights of indigenous cultures. The significant ideas are: aquatic systems provide a source of food production. Secondly, unsustainable use of aquatic ecosystems can lead to environmental degradation and the collapse of wild fisheries. And lastly, aquaculture provides potential for increased food production. Here is the first of two slides that outline the available movies in the Water Aquatic Food Production Unit. Use this outline to find the movie you need for review. This movie is outlined on the next slide. Here is the second of two slides that outlines the available movies in the Water Aquatic Food Production Unit. Use this outline to find the movie you need for review. This movie is focused right here. Here is the only IB syllabus statement for this movie. Harvesting some species, such as seals and whales, can be controversial. Ethical issues arise over bio rights, the rights of indigenous cultures, and international conservation legislation. The relationship between people and the food we eat is culturally diverse, but fundamentally based on the need for sustenance, the need for nutrition. Beyond sustenance, societies display varying attitudes in their relationship to food, ranging from spiritual reverence to family tradition to fondness of taste. Culture, religion, politics, economics, and the environment all play a role in the selection of what it is we eat. Culture, religion, politics, economics, and the environment all play a role in shaping the relationship of societies to their food. But does the demand for food by societies come at any expense? Should the demand for food by societies be evaluated against considerations for the species involved or considerations for the environment? Should societies eat meat? Are there environmental costs in choosing one type of food over another? Should we eat insects? Is it fine for any culture to eat insects? Should we eat whale? Is it fine for any culture to eat whale? Should the societal demand for food be evaluated against considerations for the species involved or considerations for the environment? Should sentient animals, smart animals, be hunted? Should bio rights be of greater importance than the rights of humans to hunt an animal or to eat generally? Should the societal demand for food be evaluated against considerations for the environment? Should we continue to hunt fish even if the nets are empty? Should the demand for food by societies be evaluated against considerations for the environment or considerations for the species involved? Should the demand for food by societies be evaluated against considerations for the cultural interests in certain types of food or certain species? For example, whether the cultural interest in a specific food has an historical basis or is part of an indigenous use of food. The principal ethical issues in providing food to societies, whether it be fisheries or terrestrial agriculture, are human well-being and ecosystem well-being. Human well-being would include sufficient and appropriate nutrition. And human well-being would also include respect for cultural ties to eating food and eating specific types of food. Ecosystem well-being would include bio rights, the rights of species to exist regardless of their use to humans. And ecosystem well-being would include diversity, the diversity of intact ecosystems. The most important food issue for humans is sufficient and appropriate nutrition, the right to food. Now remember, poverty impacts this right. The important issues for ecosystem well-being are species loss and ecosystem degradation. The tension between food availability and ecosystem well-being can pit more economically developed societies against less economically developed societies, because people in more economically developed societies have the luxury of not worrying about where their food will come from. They have the luxury of being able to consider the protection of remote ecosystems or species rather than worrying about where their next meal might come from. So, is the harvesting of some species, such as seals and whales, controversial? Ethical issues arise over biorights, the rights of indigenous cultures, and international conservation legislation. Aquaculture, fisheries included, constitute an important source of work and food for millions of people. Approximately 35 million fishermen are directly engaged in wild capture fishing and fish farming as a full-time or part-time occupation. And fishermen are particularly concentrated in less economically developed countries. So the harvesting of some species can be controversial, and ethical issues arise over the rights of the species themselves, or the rights of indigenous cultures, or the economic issues surrounding poverty, access to food, access to jobs. And lastly, how does international law account for the complexity of these issues? The loss of fisheries, or even certain species, compromises food security, it reduces economic opportunities for people, and reduces the diversity of the planet. And one may ask, who's responsible for the loss of a species? Who is responsible for the protection of a species? Is there any justification for the killing of a certain species? The depleted state of the world's fisheries presents us with pressing ecological, economic, social, and political challenges with significant ethical implications. Hunting remains a vital means of subsistence for some indigenous peoples. The hunt and the presence of the animal at the dinner table are central to their identity, central to their culture. Is it acceptable for indigenous cultures to hunt endangered species outside of international law? You might ask, are the hunters hunting sustainably? Is it acceptable to sustainably hunt any animal, even if population numbers remain strong? Some individuals would answer, no, it's not acceptable. Others would say that it is perfectly acceptable to sustainably hunt animals. But by allowing indigenous cultures to hunt, are we setting a precedent for other societies to hunt the animal as well? Is there a double standard? One might argue that it is not indigenous societies who have driven so many species to extinction. It is not indigenous societies who pose a serious threat to wildlife numbers, but instead it's commercial operations as well as poachers. Subsistence hunters tend to have low levels of technology employed in the hunt. Thus, the rate of harvest tends to be less than the rate of replacement. In other words, the harvests of animals involving low-tech methods are more likely to result in a sustainable harvest. Now, some fear that subsistence hunters pose an unacceptable risk to wildlife numbers, but there's little evidence, little scientific evidence, that this is true. Controversy and protest have surrounded whale hunting. The controversy has surfaced with indigenous tribes hunting whales. State governments and non-Indian hunters have fought to impose state and government hunting fishing regulations on Native Americans in the U.S. The rights of tribal members to hunt and fish on their own reservations in the U.S. has rarely been questioned because states generally lack the power to regulate activities on these Indian reservations in the U.S. Protests have arisen, however, over the rights of Native Americans to hunt and fish off of their reservations. The controversy has surfaced most dramatically with the commercial hunting of whales and bluefin tuna by Japanese and Norwegian fishermen. Should a culture's historical interest in eating a certain species be valued more highly than the success of the species itself? Bluefin tuna numbers have fallen dramatically in recent years, yet the IUCN cannot agree to have the bluefin tuna listed within CITES. The politics of Japanese interest in bluefin tuna keeps the tuna off CITES, allowing the continued harvest and trade of the species. Is this acceptable? Many indigenous cultures have long-standing historical and religious ties to the hunting of certain species. But is it right to hunt an animal for any reason, even if it's not endangered? And is it right for any society to hunt an animal if it is endangered? Do the rights of indigenous societies trump bio-rights, the rights of animals to live regardless of their use to people? Are indigenous groups hunting sustainably or not? Does that matter? Are the values of international law more or less important than indigenous values? Cultures have historical and cultural links to certain species. Is the Japanese cultural interest in tuna of equal stature with the indigenous tribe's interest in a whale? Is the commercial hunting of whale by Japanese fishermen different than the hunting of whale by indigenous peoples? Bluefin tuna numbers have been on the decline since the 1960s. Best estimates from the most recent 2010 stock assessment indicate that there has been a global decline of between 29 and 55% from both the western and eastern stocks of bluefin over the past 40 years. For both stocks, current harvests are far above maximum sustainable yield. Management of the eastern Atlantic bluefin stock is essential to the future of this species. Does the cultural interest in having tuna at the dinner table justify hunting it to near extinction? The politics involved in conservation have prevented the bluefin tuna from being listed on CITES, the Convention for the International Trade of Endangered Species. A CITES listing would make it illegal to hunt and trade the bluefin tuna. The politics of CITES, and Japan particularly, have kept the endangered bluefin tuna, and it is on the endangered species list, from being listed on CITES. Laws, both national and international, do protect species from hunting. In 1982, the IWC, the International Whaling Commission, decided that there should be a pause, a moratorium, in commercial whaling on all whale species and their populations from the 1985-86 season on. This pause is often referred to as the Commercial Whaling Moratorium, and it remains in place today. The ruling by the International Whaling Commission has reduced the number of hunted whales. But protests continue over the hunting of whales by countries that do not follow the IWC ban. Should exemptions be given to cultures that have long-standing cultural traditions in hunting the species? Japan, Norway, and Iceland, by way of example. The hunting of bluefin tuna, whales, and seals has been controversial. Harvesting some species, such as whales and seals, can be controversial. Ethical issues arise over bio-rights, the rights of indigenous cultures, and international conservation legislation. The harvesting of some species, such as seals and whales, can be controversial. Ethical issues arise over bio-rights, the rights of indigenous cultures, and international conservation legislation. And that brings us to the end of IBESS, Water and Aquatic Food Production, Part 9.